Hello and welcome to Leo Seise's Pantheon, a fortnightly podcast with me, your host, Leo Seises. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Today I'm in conversation with Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, a psychoanalyst, artist and writer from New York. Vanessa has been working as a psychoanalyst and psychologist since 2009 in private practice, hospital settings, mental health clinics and universities. Vanessa is also an artist, currently working in collaboration with Caitlin Foisey under the umbrella Chaos of the Third Mind. They have a particular interest in the cut-up technique as developed by artists such as Tristan Tzara, Brian Geisen and William Burroughs. Welcome, Vanessa. So I guess, first question really then is, you identify as a psychoanalyst and an artist. What came first for you?
I would say the psychoanalyst. I was interested in the arts when I was younger, like in childhood, because my mother's an artist.
Yeah.
So she was always taking me she used to teach figure drawing classes and ceramics and that sort of thing. And I was always kind of in tow going to all of her classes. So I guess that came first in that way, but I didn't identify as an artist. It was just sort of my mother's world that I was in.
Mm-hmm.
And I started being interested in Freud and Jung and psychoanalysis probably in middle school.
Right. So in America, what age is middle school then? Is that?
It's around 12, 13.
Okay.
Beginning of adolescence.
So quite young you were getting into
Freud and Jung specifically.
Significant stuff, yeah.
And I always enjoyed art, and I always went to shows, and I always had a lot of friends that were artists, but it was kind of more something I was around rather than involved in. And I only really began my own practice artistically, I guess, 5 years ago.
Okay.
I'd always go through periods where I'd paint for a little while, but it never really stuck.
Right.
And I think that's mostly because my mother is an artist, and she'd always be it was kind of her excuse for everything. Everything she'd do, she'd say, well, I'm an artist, so I kind of didn't like that growing up.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to be that way. But you can be an artist and not make it an excuse for all your quirks.
Do you feel that sort of that dynamic between you and your mum almost prevented you being able to identify as an artist for quite a long time?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Going the typical adolescent girl not wanting to be like her mother,
Yeah. What kind of artwork does your mum do, out of curiosity?
She's a painter, and she mostly does oil paintings of human figures, figures of women mostly.
Right.
So my whole house growing up was just full of these paintings of women, but they're kind of abstracted, where she has a thick black line and then just sort of color blocks.
Okay.
So they're abstracted women. So some people come in and see right away that they're figures, but other people it takes a while to figure out what it is for them.
Do you like your mum's artwork?
I do like it. And she's having a show, I'm in Florida right now, and she's having a show here in Palm Beach in a couple of weeks. So I've been helping her kind of put things together for that and hang the wires on the paintings and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
it's been fun.
Do you feel like you could collaborate with her, or is it just different? Do you just help her out?
No, I don't think so.
That's too far.
Yeah, she did. When I did the conference on psychoanalysis, art, and the occult, I did hang two of her paintings in the gallery show, and that was kind of fun to show work alongside of her. And somebody that wrote a review of the show kind of talked about the difference between our work and how they saw mine kind of stemming from hers. She does have these really thick, black lines, boundaries around her figures, and then I'm cutting everything all the time, so that was kind of interesting to read.
Yeah, the contrast between the two, massively.
Mm-hmm.
My questions actually started off more focusing on the psychotherapy stuff and moved into the artwork, but it feels like we should probably do it the other way around at the moment because we've started talking about the art. So, yeah, I know that you use the cut-up technique a lot in your artwork anyway, and you describe it on your website as getting behind the veil of conscious formulations. What is it about that process that stands out?
Well, I guess in my psychoanalytic studies, I started with Freud and Jung, and then when I was much younger, and then when I went into grad school, I kind of thought that everyone understood that all of these different lenses had their own place in looking at humans. Like even behavioralism and cognitive behavioral techniques could be used in certain ways. And then, Freud, Jung, Ferenczi all had their own perspectives, but that they all had useful parts to them. But then once I went into graduate school and then postgraduate studies, and I saw how divided everything was, the Jungians were like completely shunned and put in their own community far, far away from academia and kind of written off as like hocus pocus. And the Lacanians and the Freudians and the Kleinians all had their own like schools, and nobody really talked to one another.
Yeah.
So I found that really bizarre, but I definitely went more towards the Freudian. I figured he was who I resonated with in the beginning anyway, and I didn't want to. I considered going to this school called California Institute for Integral Studies out in Northern California, where Stanislav Grof used to teach.
Okay.
And I think he still teaches like one class there.
Oh, is he still there then?
Yeah, I think he does like very minimally, but still there.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to kind of get too focused into like a niche right away. I wanted to learn more like foundational, general psychoanalysis and then build from there. So I ended up staying in school in Miami and then going to post-grad work at New York Psychoanalytic, which said it was very Freudian. And then when I started studying Lacan after I had done psychoanalytic training there, I was really fascinated by his idea of scansion and cutting the sessions. And I've never cut sessions too short, but I do play around with it maybe in the last like 10 minutes of session. I might stop at a part that I think is particularly poignant, even if it's a few minutes early or a few minutes late, something like that.
Okay.
But I really liked the idea, and I was already, I've been reading Burroughs and Geisen, since adolescence as well. So I kind of thought this was an interesting idea, the cut in psychoanalysis and then the cut in this artwork. And then I started realizing I've written a lot of art reviews about different artists just for like, Brooklyn Rail or whatever online publications. And I started realizing, wow, all the artists that I'm really drawn to all kind of use the cut in some way or another. And that's what really got me interested in it and writing about that. And then I decided to take all these different kind of art reviews or articles that I'd written about different artists, and I thought maybe I should make a book out of that. And so I started cutting up the writing I had written about these artists to see if it would generate more ideas for my own writing. And then it was just so fascinating that I just kind of got into that, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
So the whole process sounds like almost like a cut-up technique in a way, because you're bringing in so many different... I mean, it started with is it Lacan?
Yeah.
Yeah. Could you go into a bit more about his rationale then for stopping therapy at a certain point?
The idea that's a very general idea that I like about it. I'm not Lacanian, so I'm sure they have like many more layers because they have many more layers for everything. But the idea that I took from it that I really liked was that, when you've been seeing a patient for a while and they are kind of used to the therapeutic process, you can kind of see them like they start the session, they kind of have an internal clock of like how long the session is. Yeah. And sometimes you can see them start talking and then they kind of open up and have these like really interesting insights, but then you can kind of see them kind of close back in or like go back into whatever their defense or neurosis is a little bit before the end of the session. They kind of like tie it all back up neatly so that they can like feel nice going out. And like some therapies, like supportive therapies, want people to feel nice when they're walking out. But in psychoanalysis, since somebody's coming back like sometimes the next day, it might be okay to let them leave kind of in that state where they're having more realizations or a little bit more shaken up. So the idea is if you like stop the session there where they go, oh, what about this thing? And then you're like, let's stop there. Or like, what about that thing? And they get really kind of shocked for a moment. Like, let them leave there so that they keep thinking about it from that point. And they go, what was important about that? Rather than letting them kind of close it all back up and tie it with a bow and then not really address it any further, So it's kind of a way of avoiding people undermining their own treatment through their own neuroses.
It's really interesting. I mean, the idea is, because I come from like a humanistic background. So a lot of it is kind of being sort of tracking that process and being aware of that, but there can be an overemphasis on it can feel a little bit too safe sometimes.
Right.
And I think that, like you say, with psychodynamic therapies, they seem to, historically, you might have multiple sessions a week, whereas usually the kind of pattern that I will follow is you have once a week session, sometimes once a fortnight, sometimes less than that at the university I work at. So it's there is something, a sense of like packing it up feels more appropriate in that sense, but their stuff has been exposed and you want them to think about it because that's why they're in therapy.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly, and that's the thing when you're seeing someone more, even twice a week. Like if you ever have the chance to see someone twice a week instead of just once a week, that I think that makes the biggest difference of all of the kind of frequencies, is from going from once a week to twice a week, because people really, when they come once a week, sometimes can just kind of talk about what they did that week and fill up the session. If they're trying to avoid something unconsciously, not intentionally, they can just fill up the session with what they did that week and then leave, and not really get anywhere. Absolutely. And if they're coming twice a week, if they just did that for the first time in the week, then by the time they come the second time, they can't really fill it up with like 1 or 2 days worth of information. So it kind of forces them to go a little bit further. And also, if they're coming more often, you can kind of stop in the middle of one of those epiphanies or disruptions a little bit more, feeling safe because you'll see them in a couple of days instead of like you're going to leave them with that for a week or two.
Absolutely, yeah. It's
and he even does it. The reason I don't really stop sessions like really short, because some Lacanians that are like really Lacanian will stop after like 5, 10, 15 minutes. I just can't. I can't imagine like driving all the way to therapy and then leaving after 10 minutes personally. So I wouldn't want to do that to somebody else.
You do independent therapy as well, don't you? So presumably people are paying for that.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other sort of dimension to this as well. So if you're cutting a session short by 30, 40 minutes, that
right,
it doesn't
people
quite
get
fit,
mad.
does it?
I would get mad.
Exactly.
Even if I understood why they'd be doing it, I'd be like, excuse me, this is my time,
Yeah,
but I've learned that you can actually do that while still being in the session, like not let somebody start covering things over by just the other thing I really like about Lacan, which Freud did well, in theory, Freud did as well, but he obviously like really overinterpreted sometimes to his patients. So if somebody says something, instead of saying, "Oh, you're doing this because your mom did this," and whatever, making this long interpretation, just choose like the last word that they said and say it back to them in a questioning way, like why, like wondering why you chose that word or what you mean by that, or just saying that. You can kind of keep them working on that thing instead of allowing them to kind of go back into their day-to-day neuroses.
Yeah, so you're highlighting their disclosures or the certain words they might be using. Would that account for body language as well? And
I try to put as many people on the couch as possible. I always tend to suggest it when I first start seeing someone. I tend to open the idea of coming twice a week from the beginning. Like, have you ever tried that? And also the couch, just so that they know that those are kind of options, because a lot of people don't even think about those things or know that people still do that, So I always kind of put it on the table, and then if someone comes to a point in their treatment where they're feeling a little bit stuck, I'll be like, well, we can meet more than once a week, or we could try the couch, and kind of explain to them how that's useful to get rid of these kind of social cues that they're always looking for and that sort of thing, and allow them to go deeper into their own selves and not paying so much attention to me. Or if somebody's doing really well in their treatment, they feel like this is really great and this is working really well, it's like, well, we can increase it and like keep this momentum going.
So there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of avenues, isn't there?
Yeah, it's nice when you work for yourself and you can do those things, because in the hospital or a school, it's not that way.
There's a lot of limitations. I mean, I do private work 2 days a week. I do 2 days a week for the university, and it's very different. It's very different. I mean, I am moving more and more towards working independently. I know that you used to work for institutions as well, didn't you? Do you still do that a little bit?
I don't.
You
I
don't?
left the hospital, the last hospital I was working at, in 2012. So it's been 6 years now, which is unbelievable.
Yeah.
But yeah, before that I worked in hospitals, and I worked at a university and an HIV clinic. And I also worked actually in biofeedback, which was interesting. My internship was working in a brain injury clinic,
Right.
doing like cognitive rehabilitation, and then also on the side doing biofeedback. So that was kind of a weird addition, but also kind of made sense in a way. I worked in the biofeedback lab at graduate school, and yeah, it was really interesting, and I really saw the benefits of that kind of work as well. So that's why, like, most psychoanalysts that I know are very psychoanalytic, and they would never do like breathing exercises or something like that with a patient. But I'm more of the idea of like, whatever the patient needs from you at that time, like that's what you need to provide them, instead of just feeling like you're very stringent on your way of thinking about people. Because sometimes, maybe they do need to do deeper work. Most people do, but like sometimes people are having panic attacks, and it could be useful for them to learn some techniques to manage that while they're doing the deeper work. I mean, that's what medication was originally supposed to help with, was just helping people manage symptoms while they figured out what was going on with themselves. So if you don't give people coping skills, especially today, what do you expect them to do,
Completely. I think that the whole field of psychotherapy and counselling and there's a lot of dogmatism in it. There's a lot of people making a lot of assumptions about other modalities. I mean, when I was training, because I did person-centred, the hostility towards cognitive behavioural therapy was quite astounding. But actually, a lot of CBT techniques can be really useful. You offer it to
exactly.
the client.
And I think that's the key, is not using them like these manualized treatments, where like when I was in graduate school, this graduate school I went to used to have a psychoanalytic training program, but there was only like 2 very, very old analysts left from it, and like most of the school was CBT and even behavioral therapy. And I didn't realize that going in, because I didn't know it was like also divided as it is. But I had one of my we have to do like a clinical competency exam at the end of your training, where you like present a case and defend how you treated them and everything. And I was told by like one of these more behavioral CBT people that if I didn't diagnose the patient with, I saw her for 3 years, like twice a week, and he said if I didn't diagnose her with a personality disorder, then I couldn't say that what I did was ethically correct, and that he would fail me. So I just had to like give her a personality disorder for this test. Which just made me insane. So like that kind of idea with like the manualized treatment, or we have proof that you can cure depression in 6 sessions, so if you don't do that, then you're unethical. That's insane. But that doesn't mean that someone with a more humanistic point of view can't use techniques to help people with like cognitive remediation, or like looking at things in a different way, so to keep them maintaining their lives in the meantime.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I think that the thing with the CBT and behavioural models is that they largely work within the medical model, don't they? There's a lot of ties to the medical industry, and obviously the whole diagnosis thing raises a lot of issues. It raises a lot of issues.
Yeah, and I think right now we're seeing kind of a backlash. I mean, at least here, they're doing all these studies now looking at like these pharmaceuticals, and we're having this opioid crisis. All these people are ODing from pharmaceuticals. But I also think people are just tired of being labeled as pathological constantly. And I think I'm going to try to run with that in the mental health field, while this whole like Me Too movement, Time's Up movement, like patriarchal crumbling is like potentially happening. Because it's the same thing, like saying someone's symptomatic means that they are diseased, they're pathological, something's wrong with them, rather than maybe there's something wrong with their family that made them behave that way, or maybe there's something wrong with society that made them behave that way.
Exactly.
Or there's at least an interplay between the individual and their environment, not that everyone has a mental illness.
Yeah. I mean, when you get to the area of personality disorders, I mean, take borderline even narcissism, they're almost always, in my experience and a lot of other people's, trauma-based.
Yeah.
It goes right back to some kind of complex trauma. I mean, not a single event, but a family dynamic or a social dynamic.
Ongoing abuse.
Absolutely. So personality disorders, in a sense, are a survival strategy. And
right, it's a way that people learned to be in the world that worked for them when they were in a certain environment growing up. Exactly. That maybe doesn't work so well once they're out of that environment. But it happened for a reason. And all symptoms actually are that way. They all become the way they are for a reason, because they are working in some way. So that's something else I always try to get patients to see with my questioning, is like, well, how might you be benefiting for that, or how might that be doing something for you? Because if it didn't have a benefit, people wouldn't be doing it. People aren't as messed up pathologically as they're told to believe. Like, everything people do functions in some way, you know?
I mean, that goes to, you know, you're trying to encourage there a little bit of self-compassion, in terms of coming to terms with and accepting one's own behaviour, even if it seems maladaptive. It originally had a function, it had a purpose, and coming to some acceptance and self-compassion about that is really important.
Right, and trying to understand where it came from, or how it's functioning, or how it did function, rather than just judging yourself.
Yeah.
And even like working in the hospital, the last place I worked in the HIV clinic, I mean, every patient I had was like bipolar, borderline, schizophrenic, schizoaffective, like they're like all these diagnoses. Meanwhile, everybody's like low SES, like low income, grew up in the welfare system, grew up completely impoverished, tons of sexual abuse, tons of, you know, impoverished conditions, drug abuse around them, and then they're all schizophrenic. It's like, no, they're not. They've all grown up in really difficult conditions and aren't functioning super well as a result. You know, they're not schizophrenic.
Yeah,
so that was really frustrating.
My gripes about the whole psychiatric diagnosis thing. I'm not totally against it. I must say that, you know, I can see some benefits in it in some sense, but on the whole, it's like you say, it's labeling people, it's reductionistic, it's far more complex than what it's got to offer. And another thing that I was going to point out is it's often class-based.
Exactly.
And I'm very uncomfortable with that. I think that's a big gripe of mine.
Yeah, and we should be. That's what I'm saying. I'm going to try to work moving forward and like making people more aware of that as we have this momentum with, you know, people seeing the systemic racism here, and people seeing the systemic misogyny that's been present. Also with mental health diagnoses. My friend Patricia Geravici wrote this great book called The Puerto Rican Syndrome. She's a Lacanian from Argentina who lives in Philadelphia now. And she talks about the whole history of like the psychology in America, and the fact that like Puerto Rico is basically a colony, but they don't have as many rights as we do on the mainland, but they still have to fight in our wars. They can't vote, you know, and obviously how they're being treated now with the hurricane. I mean, they almost just took away their disaster relief. Was it earlier this week, and decided that they weren't going to give them any more federal funding to help rebuild when still like almost half of them don't have electricity. I mean, it's insane. But she was just talking about like how the Puerto Rican soldiers were given these kind of borderline hysteria diagnoses because they just were from a different cultural background that it reacted to stress in a different way than they were used to on the mainland, and then they were pathologized because of that. And that really leads into like my work with the occult, and that really started in much the same way, in that like a lot of these views that are seen as occult are really just other world views from other cultures.
Yeah.
And the fact that like psychoanalysts or academics can say that, you know, they obviously see the problem with colonialism and how it's created racism and how you've taken these societies or civilizations that were different than yours and written them off as primitive just because they were working differently in the world than you were or whatever. But they don't allow that with their like magical beliefs or their folk magical beliefs or their beliefs in working with their ancestors or their dead. Like, it goes only to a certain limit, but as soon as you bring it to that territory, they're like, oh, they're psychotic, they're primitive still. And I just think that's ridiculous.
it's a narrow worldview, it's a dogmatic worldview, because really what you're talking about is that human beings are capable of having different worldviews, but even within one individual as well, that you can almost switch between different worldviews. So a magical worldview, an occult worldview, can be really, really valuable in instances where sometimes you might need a more rational mindset, for example. But people get locked into one perspective. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's the same thing like we were saying with the different psychological views. Like, oh, like, you can't believe this thing that Jung said because it goes against this thing that Lacan said or Freud said. And it's like, but maybe it's true in different situations. Like, maybe it's true for this patient and not this patient. So isn't it useful to kind of have all these lenses to look through, to like work with different people in different ways? Or maybe the same patient might change over the course of their treatment, and maybe something that they needed, like breathing exercises in the beginning, then they won't need, and then they'll be ready to move into the more analytic work or something like that. Like, you have to be flexible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, as if people don't evolve during their lifespan. We're supposed to have this one identity from birth till death. That's unhealthy.
I also find interesting recently, I've sort of been applying it as a model in therapy, like the idea of, like different aspects to ourselves and how that is sort of cross-modality as well. So, for example, in transactional analysis, you've got the parent, child, adult, ego states. And that's a really useful model in therapy with clients sometimes, to help them understand what might be going on in terms of relational dynamics with others. But it doesn't mean that they literally have to exist, that there are 3 ego states of any individual, literally. But the literal world doesn't have to be the only world.
Yeah, it's not.
It's not, exactly. It's just not.
It's just not, yeah. And psychologists, of all people, should know that. But unfortunately, it's not encouraged because of the over-medicalization of the field.
When you did your conference then, because we had a brief chat on Twitter about it, but it sounds like it got a lot of attention from more mainstream psychology institutions. Is that right?
Yeah, it was really fun. So I told you in the beginning that I'm working on this book about violence. I'm actually working on 2 that are similar. But they stemmed from this conference that I did the year before with my friend and fellow psychoanalyst Manya Steinkohler here in New York. And we did it at Fordham University, and it was on psychoanalysis and violence, and the conference was in May of 2015, so it was like Black Lives Matter was starting then. We were having riots like in Baltimore and that sort of thing, but it was pre-Trump, and I had left the hospital that I worked in, and I had a really hard time leaving that clinic, because I really felt like I was kind of abandoning the patients there, because the staff was just so overworked, and the patients, we're getting terrible care, and like where I used to want to see patients like once or twice a week, I was only allowed to see patients maybe every other week for like 20 minutes. Like, I was seeing 3 patients an hour because I had such a huge caseload that I was in a union and that wasn't allowed, but it was like, well, what are we going to do with all these patients? Because basically what the hospital did, I started working there right after the economic collapse in 2008. And so basically what the hospital had decided to do, this is a city hospital, this is a government-run hospital, they decided to do was not fire anyone or have any layoffs, but they decided that when people left their positions, not to fill the position.
So every time somebody left, you took on
so every
more
time
work.
someone left, their caseload would get divided among the rest of us, until it was like, I think there was 7 of us when we started, and then the psychiatrist that was only there part-time, and then by the end it was like me and one other, I was only there half-time by the end because I was working more in my private practice, and then one full-time psychologist, and then like 1 social worker. That was it. And we had just as many patients as we had been seeing between like the 7 or 8 of us. So it was just, I just couldn't, I didn't feel ethically right treating people that way. Like, it was basically just seeing people filling out forms, making sure we got our grants, like making people fill out questionnaires, and then being like, okay, are you suicidal? No? Okay, great. See you in 2 weeks. You know? I mean, that was basically it. So I left, and when I left, I really wanted to do something to get people to understand how poor the treatment was, because being from Miami, and then living in California and then moving to New York, you think, you know, New York City is like the richest city in the country, and that they would really have it together, you know, more than other places in the country. And they do in some ways, but their economic divide between like the upper class and the lower class is so severe, and the different ways that people get treated based on their class or the neighborhood they live in is, I mean, I just didn't even imagine that kind of discrepancy moving into New York. And then it took me a while to see like how poorly these people were being treated, because I worked in ostensibly like the worst neighborhood in Brooklyn, economically, and it was just, I mean, it was just terrible to see how people were treated. We even had like the sewer would overflow, and there'd be like raw sewage in the hallway, and I would go to the front desk and be like, I'm not working in this condition. I mean, my patients have AIDS, and you want me to walk them past raw sewage to go to therapy? I was like, I'm leaving. And then like they made it out like I was being this diva, and I was like, this is not correct. Like, we're in a hospital. They're like, oh, this happens every year when the snow melts. I'm like, well, maybe something should be done about that. You know, like it was kind of insane. So anyway,
it's like that becomes normality. And you speaking out about it, you get classed as some kind of diva, like you say, or like a loud mouth.
Yeah, it was hysteric woman that was making a big deal over it, you know, like usual.
Like,
that's just like this
sewage
is a real
on the floor.
Yeah, like literally, and it happened like I think 4 times when I worked there. So anyway, and I would always just leave. I'm like, I'm not working like this. But anyway, when I left, I really wanted people to know what was going on. And my sister's a journalist, and she's like, put it in the newspaper. I'm like, I don't really want to be that person either, putting everything in the newspaper. But I want to like try to do something constructive. So me and my friend Vanya had this conference on violence and systemic violence. And it was really great, and we learned a lot, but it was so kind of depressing reading just things about violence for like 6 months straight, you know, and then doing this like 3-day conference about it. That was basically like we were at the dinner, like the big dinner during the conference, and I was just like drinking wine and being like, oh, I'm so glad this is done. This has been really hard to be immersed in. And I said, I need to do something fun. Like, I want to do a conference on art and like psychoanalysis and the occult or something like that. And this Danny Nobus, who's over there, he just became the chair of the Freud Museum, and he was sitting next to me, and he's like, we should have that conference at the Freud Museum. And I was like, are you serious? You're going to let me have a conference about the occult in the Freud Museum? You know? And he's like, yeah, why not? He's like, we're trying to make it like more fun, have more events there. So that just blew my mind, and I was really excited about that. But it turns out it's like very, very small, and I wanted to have like a big 3-day conference and have like 25 speakers, and they said that you could only keep like 25, 30 people in there at a time, so it would just be like packed apparently. I haven't actually ever been there, so I haven't seen it, but it ended up not working out so well, so we decided to have a conference in a gallery space instead, and to have the artists that were kind of part of the conference show artwork as well. So that worked out really well, and I think having like working inside the artwork, a lot of it was artwork made by people who are also occultists, and then I made sure that the panels were like mixed between psychoanalysts, artists, and occultists, so it wasn't like only psychoanalysts talking to each other or that sort of thing. Made it for a really interesting dialogue.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, you said you had a really positive response as well from a lot of psychoanalysts, which is quite surprising.
I was wondering what everyone would think that I was doing this, but they all seem to think it's fun, and they're having a good time with it instead of being judgmental. I don't know what they say behind my back, though, but...
No, well, they turned up, obviously, and, you know, who knows. But my experience of the psychotherapy field, I don't know whether it's different there, I imagine not. It's so square, white, middle-aged, middle class. there's something wrong with that. I just think that what you're
Or
doing and what you've managed to do and sort of get in there and sort of bring these ideas to the forefront, because Freud did have an interest in this stuff, Jung did have an interest in this stuff. It underpinned a lot of the basis of the entire field, and it's like it's just snubbed out now by mainstream academia. I find that quite disturbing.
Ridiculous. I was even reading the other day, like, I was reading something that was referencing, like, Sophocles and Euripides and, like, their references to Hecate and that sort of thing. And I just was thinking, even then, like, even literature and philosophy, like, you take these ideas from these authors and scholars and philosophers, and then you pick and choose what you think is valid, but they completely write out this, like, pantheon of beliefs that they had, as if, like, oh, that was just back then and that's how people thought with the gods and everything. It's like, maybe there's something to it. Maybe you shouldn't just write out half of their thought, you know?
So what do you think about the future, then, of psychotherapy? Do you think we're moving into a more fluid, open-minded state with it?
I think we have to. I think that, I think culturally in general, so this is why, one of the reasons why I'm writing more books now, and not having, like, a full-time private practice as much. I just have, like, a handful of patients I see, but I'm trying to do more, like, talks and events and that sort of thing, is that I really want to get psychoanalytic ideas out to the mainstream culture more, because as soon as you present people with them, they get it. Like, they understand it because they're living in it as well, you know? Like, once you kind of give words or language or theory to kind of experiences they had, they're like, oh, yeah, this happened to me. It reminds me of this and that sort of thing. And I feel like our culture in general needs to become more psychologically minded, or we're not going to get anywhere, because we just have this insane repetition and this guilt and this repression, and it just keeps circling around and around. And until, like, I mean, being in America, like, until America realizes what it's done, comes to terms with it a little bit more, and like works from that position, this is not going anywhere good. So I really want, I figure if you can kind of talk to more individuals and get more individuals thinking psychologically about themselves in their own mind, maybe it'll keep spreading to a larger and larger culture. Hopefully.
I hope so.
That's my dream. You know?
Yeah.
We're definitely having a problem over here.
Yeah, and it's not the same here. It's obviously different countries, but I mean, the Tory party are in charge here. They have been since 2010, and you got, I mean, people in the papers all the time, homeless people. There's a lad last week, 17 years old, in Birmingham, and he froze to death. And this is happening. This is happening every single day. You know, it's a tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy.
It's tragic. Yeah, it's absolutely
on
tragic.
The flip side of that, there's been a response to it, and more people are sort of speaking up in a more sophisticated rather than a reactive way, and making really valid social points. So I feel that for the first time ever that I'm aware of in British society, that in the mainstream, class is beginning to be acknowledged. Whereas it was it was suppressed for about 40 years, almost as if, class doesn't exist anymore. No, it absolutely does. And
absolutely.
Yeah. So these things are starting to come out more. Like, say, the Black Lives Matter movement in America is a voice and is being heard more, and the whole stuff about sort of the transgender and sexual assault allegations that have come to the surface. Something's brewing.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's positive. And this is interesting. I've been reading, because I'm doing all of this work on this book about violence. It stemmed from that conference that I did before the occult one. I've been reading Freud and Einstein's correspondence on why war. And I just actually sent it. So there's this group, Hagins, that me and a few disgruntled psychoanalytic candidates at the time started, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago now. I guess it was, 6 years ago or so, right before I left the hospital. And it's basically, we realized that, like, the conferences we were going to felt dead. Everybody was, like, very old and, like, single-minded and not talking to other schools of thought and just kind of talking to themselves and to the people in their school, and it didn't feel like it was going anywhere. And we were kind of like, no wonder psychoanalysis is dead, or that's what everyone says about it. It's like, it kind of is dead if this is all that's happening. But there was also at the same time this kind of new resurgence of a new generation of people that were interested in psychoanalysis, but that this was kind of killing our creativity and our way of thinking. They were just trying to kind of make us think like they did, and that wasn't working very well. So we decided, like, when we'd see a speaker that was coming to New York for some other reason, we would email them and we'd say, hey, we have this, like, rogue psychoanalytic group of, like, young analysts. We don't have money, but, like, since you're here anyway, would you like to talk to us? And, like, all these other analysts loved it, so we just had all these events based on that. And actually our very first event was with Otto Kernberg, and I don't know why he agreed to talk to us, but he did. And he wrote a paper and gave a talk called 30 Ways to Kill the Creativity of a Psychoanalytic Candidate. It was great. So that was really fun. So anyway, we've been doing events like that since then, and we have a listserv. We have, like, a main listserv for announcements and events and stuff, but then we have, like, a discussion listserv called the Hagins Salon. So if, like, you're reading a book or you go to a talk or something, or a current event sparks your interest and you want to kind of have more of a psychological or psychoanalytically viewed discussion about it with other people, you can kind of write on the Salon listserv. And I actually just sent this to them right before you and I started speaking, because I've been reading this Freud and Einstein correspondence, Why War? And Freud's response to Einstein when he first contacted him, Freud said, you begin with the relation between right and might. There can be no doubt that this is the correct starting point for our investigation. But may I replace the word might by the balder and harsher word violence? Today, right and violence appear to us as antitheses. It can be easily shown, however, that one has developed out of the other. Then he talks a little bit about, like, people dominating other people, and then he goes on to say, such then was the original state of things, domination by whoever had the greater might, domination by brute violence or by violence supported by intellect. As we know, this regime was altered in the course of evolution. There was a path that led from violence to right or law. What was that path? It is my belief that there was only one, the path which led by way of the fact that the superior strength of a single individual could be rivaled by the union of several weaker ones. Violence could be broken by union and by the power of those who were united, now representing law, in contrast to the violence of the single individual. Thus we see that right is the might of a community. It is still violence, ready to be directed against any individual who resists it. It works by the same methods and follows the same purposes. The only real difference lies in the fact that what prevails is no longer the violence of an individual, but that of a community. But in order that the transition from violence to this new right or justice may be effected, one psychological condition must be fulfilled. The union of the majority must be a stable and lasting one. If it were only brought about for the purpose of combating a single dominant individual, and were dissolved after his defeat, nothing will have been accomplished. The next person who thinks himself superior in strength would once more seek to set up a dominion by violence, and the game would be repeated infinitely. The community must be maintained permanently, must be organized. And he says the communal feelings that tie these people together are the source of their true strength. So that I thought was a really important point, because we're all thinking, like, okay, what after Trump if he gets impeached, whatever, what after this wave of, like, Me Too and Time's Up and Black Lives Matter? Are we going to go, we're all going to be comfortable and it's all going to be the same thing again? Like, I think that's kind of what happened under Obama, because everybody under Bush, we were all like agitated and horrified at what was going on, and then we got Obama, and we're all like, "Hooray! Like we finally did the right thing here. We got a good guy in."
Yeah,
and it kind of became complacent, and now we ended up with this mess, you know. So it's like how do we keep this wave going this way without repeating this cycle again? I think that's key.
Well, I guess things like, you know, you set up das Unbehagen. I hope that's the right pronunciation. But that sounds like it's almost functioning in a way as a community base, pull people together, and in a microcosm sense, what it's functioning as it's not a retaliation against the dominant force of the state of the field of psychotherapy at the moment, but it's a valid response to it, and you're raising a lot of questions about why is it this stagnant? Why does it have to be this way? Let's communicate. Let's start talking together. And this is what is happening on a larger scale with these movements, I think. That, like you say, people are being less complacent at the moment, but the communication and the community needs to sustain itself somehow.
Exactly.
Yeah. How do you foresee that? How do you foresee that sustaining itself? Obviously, we don't have an answer, but
yeah, I mean, the only way I'm doing it is writing books, giving talks, making art, and hopefully helping other people to be more psychologically minded, and hopefully, therefore, making the culture a bit more psychologically minded. I don't know what else to do.
You're raising awareness of power dynamics, I suppose. Yeah. I mean, I was actually going to ask you about das Unbehagen.
The word comes from civilization and its discontents. Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, that Freud wrote, where he said when you're in a society, you're automatically going to be in a sense of malaise because there's all these kind of things in place, structures in place that keep us a bit repressed so that we can function with other people. But Manya and I have been talking about it, and we're like, we don't think that word fits so much for what's going on in society now, because we're in a bit of a state that's a bit more than malaise. Like, we're not like a little depressed. We're kind of more in like a constant panic mode that maybe is making some people really engaged, but also might be shutting people down in another way just from being so overwhelmed.
Yeah, I mean, you could well be on the verge of quite a severe fascism. Yeah, I'm being in Florida. I'm in Florida right now visiting my parents, and people here are getting deported left and right. They're going on buses. I read that people are taking their kids to school, and they're getting snatched up and deported when they drop off their kids to school. I mean, it's horrendous. Scary, isn't it?
So,
and
we'll see.
The trauma effects of society with that kind of behaviour is not going to heal anytime soon, is it either? You know, even if Trump gets impeached and someone, I don't know, a little more beneficent comes in,
there's so many underlying structures. I kind of think of it as like Trump's our symptom that finally got everyone's attention of like how messed up everything is. But working in the hospital system, like I said, and seeing how terribly my patients there were treated that were lower economic status, and like you think about the pharmaceutical companies and how do you change that, and they affect our food supply here, and those food suppliers also provide schools to the prisons. There's the whole prison problem where, like, even though the United States is 5% of the world population, we have 25% of the prisoners in the world here. And then you think of the food supply in the elementary schools, and our education system in general is terrible. And like, why don't we give people free college? Well, if you give people free college, then how are you going to get them to go to war for you? Because the only reason most people sign up for the military nowadays is because they are from lower economic strata, and they have the chance of getting free healthcare and free education if they join the military.
Well, Trump is a symbol of all of that stuff, isn't he? And I'm just thinking, like, from a more magical perspective of the world, do you think that Trump is almost a blessing in disguise in a sense, because he personifies oppressive structures that have been operating in the background for years and years and years, that he's almost highlighted a problem which has started to generate a response to it. It's
right.
It's
so
a
even
it's
though,
a
like,
risky
I really, really,
question,
really
but
wish that Hillary would have won. If Hillary would have won, then all these things going on beneath the surface would have continued, I think, for much longer, the way they had been continuing for decades. Whereas now, nobody can pretend that this isn't the way this country's running, because it's been running like this for a long time. It's just that we've been repressing it, basically. You know, and some would argue that the country was founded on this. You know, I just read Ta-Nehisi Coates' most recent book, and he talks about, you know, the country's was stolen land from one group of people, and then you stole people from their land to, like, work for these settlers, and made a bunch of money off of, like, free labor. So, like, one of my hoodoo friends said, you know, when everyone was in shock about Trump winning, he said, how did you people think this was going to turn out? You know, like, you stole land from natives who are very magical people and tied to the land, and then you stole other very magical people who are tied to their land from their land and had them work for you. Like, how did you think that was going to work out? It wasn't going to work out well. So that could be argued as well. That's probably the only thing that made me feel better about it, was when he told me that. I was like, you know what, that makes sense.
Yeah, so you can sort of see it in history more, rather than thinking, oh my God, it's like, this is the worst thing. It's like, this has been going on since the very beginning.
Since the beginning, yeah. It just came to a crescendo. It's at a breaking point.
I do think it's possibly a little unfair on America, or the United States rather, saying that, though, because I imagine you could go back in any culture and find similar themes and patterns happening anyway, you know, anywhere in the world. There's always going to be some group of dickheads who just want to bully everyone else, basically. Yeah. Anyway.
It's true.
But I think you've answered most of the questions that I had. Is there anything else that you want to sort of add to the conversation at this point?
I guess I'll just say that art-wise, my artistic partner, Caitlin Foisey, and I are going to have a book out later this year called Chaos of the Third Mind. That's going to have all the cut-ups in it, and it's pressed by Fulgur, which is out of the UK. And he presses, Robert Ansel Fulgur presses, like, these beautiful art books, and he actually came up with the idea of making our book kind of like a box instead of a linear book. So that each page is going to be, you know, facsimiles of cut-ups, but also we do, like, videos, so there'll be, like, film stills and then collages and writing, and making it so that you can shuffle the entire book like a big cut-up. And I think that'll be really great, because what Caitlin and I realized in doing this work and in giving talks about it, and watching, like, YouTube videos of Burroughs giving talks about it, like, Burroughs, every time he talks about it, he's always trying to tell people to try it for themselves. It's like, you know, you can do this. Anyone can do this. You don't have to use your own writing. Use a newspaper. Use a magazine. Cut up whatever's in front of you. Because it's really about that process of cutting that does something which is a little unexplainable. But just like psychoanalysis, you can't really understand how it works unless you've been through it yourself. So we always want to get people to actually experience the cut-ups. So when Caitlin and I do talks, a lot of times we'll, like, hand out cut-ups or have a box of cut-ups for people to use and that sort of thing. So it's really fun that this book itself is going to be kind of a giant cut-up. And we even decided, in the last time we all talked together, that we're not even going to have too much, like, explanatory text explaining exactly what we're doing here and how we got here. Because we really want it to be more experiential and have people figure out what they get from it on their own. So that's something to look forward to.
You know, Chaos of the Third Mind, then, is that just the title of the book, or is that what your collaborative project is?
I guess it's turned into both.
Yeah.
It was just the title of, I mean, we decided to do a book, I don't know, like 2 years ago, and that's what we decided to call it. And then it's kind of turned into everything, but we have a website that's chaosofthethirdmind.com that has a lot of our videos and work on it. Cool. But my husband Carl coined the term the 23rd mind. So instead of it being the third mind, called it the 23rd mind, because a lot of these writers are into the number 23. So I like that. So sometimes I hashtag things 23rd mind. And actually mentioning Carl and I actually just started a Patreon because we were kind of disappointed, like when we had social media and not as many quote unquote friends. You know, it was kind of a place to like get ideas around and talk to people more. But now it's really become just a place where I kind of advertise what we're doing. You know, here's this book, here's this talk, or here's my friend's talk, or whatever. And that kind of community aspect was lost. And I also wanted to start writing more about my process of what I'm doing with the cut-ups, because I've been just doing them, immersed in doing them for the past few years. But now I'm at the point where I think I'm ready to get back to that original book idea I had, and like write about it.
Bring in ideas
and so I wanted kind of a blog or a place to do that. I've never really had that. Being an analyst, I always kind of shied away from having any public persona, so it took me a few years to get comfortable with having that out there, that kind of thing, like my personality existing in the world.
I know that's something that I've tackled with. Obviously, I told you about, the whole idea of being Leo Zayzays online is to really to differentiate myself from my psychotherapy work. It's a big thing to consider. I think it's very personal, isn't it, about certain boundaries and personal boundaries, and how much do you want your clients potentially knowing about your life and how that can affect the therapy with them potentially. But I also think it could have a really positive effect, and I think that I don't mind having a few movie posters around the house, or whatever it is. It
just analyze it like everything else. That's what I've learned, because
Exactly.
it was a really hard transition for me to make
I'm a human
into
being
having
too.
a
You're
personality.
human
But
being.
I also realized, like, for my own sanity, it's not a good position for me to be in, always just being the blank for the other person to project on. Like, I need to not be that. I need to have my own life. And so I kind of see it like, I mean, everybody Googles you, but like if they look, then they have to deal with what they see. It's just like peeking in your parents' bedroom when you hear the noise, Oh, what is that? You know what that is. And then you look in there and then you see something you don't like. Well, that's what happens when you look in there,
I would agree with that. Yeah, absolutely.
I just try to talk about it.
And you can then talk about that in a therapy. What led to you making a decision to want to know more about me on a personal note.
Right.
Yeah. And that
exactly.
Can be part
just
of the
like
therapy.
Everything else.
Exactly.
Just analyze it like everything else they bring in. And I honestly have had more positive responses than negative responses. I can only think of one patient that was really kind of weirded out because she read an article in Vice or something about me that said I was a witch, and she was like, I don't know what that means, And I was like, I didn't say that. This is like person sensationalizing things or whatever. I didn't even say that to her. I just was like, what does that mean to you? But then she ended up like buying a book on like ancient witchcraft or something, trying to understand it.
Well, exactly.
But most people are just like, oh, this is where the art comes in really handy, and why the art was essential between the psychoanalysis and occult, because it kind of gives you this leeway to talk about the occult or magic or something. It was like when people think it's art, or you look at it as art, then it's much more palatable. They're like, oh yeah, artists are weird. Artists do those things. Artists can explore these things symbolically,
Whereas if you say you're into magic, they think that you'd worship in the devil and you'd sacrifice children or something.
It's ridiculous.
It really is.
So I try to frame it either through artistic lenses a lot of times, or just through other cultural worldviews.
Yeah.
Like every single culture that's ever existed has had magical practices, folk magic.
Yeah.
Where do you think medicines came from originally? They came from people putting things together from the earth.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Get over it. It's part of our history that's been repressed.
But it's also important, I guess, to be this and be true to ourselves and authentic in that sense, because in doing so, we are challenging the status quo of the field we're in as well, and it's making me think, certainly. It's definitely making me think.
Yeah, and who's decided we can't think these things? I mean, especially psychologists, we shouldn't be judging people. We should be open-minded to what they're thinking and where that's coming from, and have an understanding of it, like we said in the beginning, rather than going, oh, that's magical thinking, they're becoming psychotic. It's ridiculous. Like, whose idea is that? It's those old white guys and psychiatrists from 60 years ago. It's just not valid.
Yeah, completely agree. It's been a brilliant chat.
Yeah, super fun.
Thank
you
very
touch.
much. Yeah, will do. You take care.
Bye.
Bye.